If you live in a country with a very definite winter season, then you might be lucky enough to have a dedicated bike for that, so one with cheaper components and full mudguards, meaning that you can save your posh bike for those carefree, heady summer days. But how do you store your posh bike over the winter so that come spring it is in tip-top condition and ready to roll? Well, there's two parts to this. The first is to make sure that your bike is completely clean before then applying the right products to it to make sure that it stays in perfect condition despite inactivity. So the first step therefore is to wash it. Now, as ever here on GCN, we think that washing your bike with water is much more effective than without. So I have a bucket of soapy water just over there, but I'm actually going to start by degreasing the drivetrain. Now, in this case, I'm going to spray it on, but you might have degrease that needs brushing on. Now, while we're leaving that to work, we're going to just rinse the rest of the bike first. I'm going to quickly rinse the degreaser off my drivetrain now. To make sure the rest of the bike is really clean as well, I'm going to spray on a specific bike cleaner and then leave it for a couple of minutes to do its work. Now it's completely clean, the next step is really important as well, and that is to make sure that it is completely dry. So we could just leave it to drip dry, but I'm also going to try and encourage any excess off the drivetrain just by spinning the cranks, and then I'll also towel dry the frame as well. At this point, I'm also going to remove the seat post as well, making sure that obviously you've marked the height, but just so then we can let any water that might have got into the frame, not necessarily through this wash, but in the whole season, just to drip out, just to make sure it's not just sat in there if you are storing it. Now, I'm going to hold the frame upside down. It is kind of bad form to leave your bike upside down, resting on the levers, so just hang fire for a minute. If nothing's coming out, and you really hope that it wouldn't, then just flip the bike up again. We need to pop the post back in, then head into the workshop. Back in the workshop now. Before reattaching the post, I will give it a good smear of fibre grip. And it's particularly important if you're using a metal post or a metal frame. In that case, you'll probably need to give it a good covering of grease instead, because a seized seat post is the devil's own work. And leaving your bike for months is asking for trouble. Now, this greasing theme is going to carry on a bit. I'm going to turn to my headset next, because I often find that after a period of inactivity that the headset is either sticky or indeed corroded. So to prevent that, we're going to take it apart and completely clean, degrease and then re-grease before reassembling. It's a simple process. Just undo the top cap on the stem and then undo the stem bolts itself, take the stem off. Give the steerer tube a sharp tap, and that should loosen what's called the centering sleeve, allowing you to take the forks out and giving you access to those bearings. And it's this lower bearing race that's particularly important. So we just need to make sure that it's completely clean, completely dry, and then re-grease it and reassemble it. I'm going to repeat the process at the bottom bracket now. Exactly how and what you have to do does depend on what type of bottom bracket you have. And there are, unfortunately, a gazillion different types of bottom brackets out there. But essentially, the process is roughly the same. It needs to be clean, degreased, and then re-greased as well. So you've got to take your cranks off and then inspect what you've got. Make sure it's all sorted. Next, I'm going to remove the pedals. Now, I would have said it's important to re-grease the axles before refitting them, but if you're going to go to the lengths of taking them off, there's actually not all that much point in putting them back on again before you store the bike. It certainly makes it easier to store it without any pedals. I'm going to spray a really light aerosol lube over all the drivetrain parts now as well. I certainly don't want to use anything heavier. There's no point in doing that. And while we're looking at the drivetrain, I have in the past, I confess, had to spend quite a bit of money repairing a frame where the barrel adjuster bolts had got seized into it. So if you do have barrel adjuster bolts on external cables, then I suggest now is a very good time to re-grease them. To do that, you just need to make sure that your chain is in your biggest sprocket, and then with the wheel not moving, click down to release all that cable tension, and then you can remove the cable from the barrel adjuster. I'm going to keep the tyres inflated. I think that's the best way of keeping them in good condition, although they will lose pressure over time. If you're particularly worried about them because, I don't know, you've got like a museum piece and you're not going to ride it for another 30 years, then you might want to consider hanging the bike when you store it, just to prevent any damage to those uninflated tyres. But for most of us, that's not going to be a problem. One final tip is if you're using a steel frame, and that is to use a rust inhibitor on it. Because if any moisture has got inside those tubes, then it could start to rust from the inside out. And that would happen whether it's in storage or you're riding it, but using a rust inhibitor will massively prolong the lifespan of your frame. Other than that, the process will be exactly the same. You make sure it's completely clean, lightly lubed, and then re-grease, particularly any bolt as well that might end up getting seized. Otherwise then, that bike is good to go. Or rather not go, in fact, because it's going to be in storage. I would make sure that I leave it inside at least until it's completely dry, and only then could I move it potentially outside to somewhere unheated but also dry, like a shed or a garage. Ideally though, this will come back in the house and live, I don't know, maybe in the living room. Or maybe an attic, actually, probably. Now, if you want a bit more information about exactly how you service a headset or a bottom bracket, both processes we've touched on today, we've got videos, you can get through to either of them just by clicking up there. Otherwise, to subscribe to GCN, why don't you click on the bike that's just about to go into hibernation. Actually, it's not going into hibernation. Who am I kidding? I can't put that away. I'm going to ride it all winter. I'm just going to look after it really well.